This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Eve Engler. Today we're going to discuss the somewhat divergent reactions to Donald Trump's threats of 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico. Um, Based upon whether they do what he wants on drugs and people coming into the country or other things. We don't know exactly what he wants. Um, Canadian politicians' reaction, initial reaction was to basically fall over backwards to placate the incoming president. You had Trudeau going down to Mar-a-Lago. You had Pierre Poilievre saying he was adopting a Canada First form or Canada First policy, which was essentially whatever Donald Trump wanted. And in contrast, you have a New Mexican president from the left, Claudio Sheinbaum, who responded by saying, "Well, if you bring in tariffs, we will respond in kind," by blaming the Americans for guns flowing into Mexico. And the like, a much more dignified, if you like, response to the incoming U.S. Bully. To discuss this, we have Mexico City-based journalist Jose Luis Granado Ceja, who is a staff writer at Venezuela Analysis, who is with the podcast Soberania. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. And can you I guess, contrast the reaction of the Mexican government with Justin Trudeau's reaction to Donald Trump?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be on here and talk about this topic. I'm really glad you did because I think there's really a lot of lessons to be learned in contrasting the reactions to this Trump tariff threat from Mexico and from Canada. And as you said in your intro, what we saw from Mexico was a very dignified response. And I like the word that you used, that word. Claudia Sheinbaum, who recently took office in October, she is the successor to Andrés Manuel López Obrador, elected in 2018, which very much marked the end of the neoliberal era here in Mexico. And what we've seen with Claudia Sheinbaum is a commitment to not only continue what's called here domestically the fourth transformation of Mexico, a post-neoliberal nationalist development type of political program, and actually deepen it. And she's been really encouraging to see that she has been really quite good at taking office and really assuming leadership here. And this was an important early test. So, as you said again in your intro, Trump comes out and following his election victory in the United States, saying he's going to impose 25% tariffs on his major trading partner, Canada and Mexico. And with the excuse that this is going to be the instrument he's going to use to be able to compel Mexico to crack down on organized crime groups, to stop the drugs from flowing, to do something about all of the violence that's happening here, as if, this wasn't one of the top priorities in Mexico and has been for many decades at this point now. But like you said, Claudia Sheinbaum sees this threat and gives a very dignified response. She publishes this letter. And now there's some analysts who say it was for a domestic audience, but obviously the message was received at Mar-a-Lago in Trump's headquarters there, where she says, if you do this, you are going to destroy our economies. Kind of really quite bluntly saying, all we're going to do is impose tariffs on each other back and forth until this shared relationship falls apart. Now, it's quite strange for me as somebody who identifies as a leftist to be here defending a free trade agreement, but there are consequences to decisions that were taken in the 90s, right? Our economies are deeply integrated. This would be disastrous for the North American relationship, for the North American economy, Canada, US, and Mexico. Everybody would come out losing if there's a sudden decision to try to really rupture these deeply integrated economies. Obviously, Mexico in the last few years has become the number one trading partner of the United States. And so it's a very important market for Mexico. That's something that they're not willing to really so easily say goodbye to. But nonetheless, like you said, there is our dignity at stake here. This is about defending Mexican sovereignty. Sovereignty is one of the pillars of the fourth transformation, saying we have the right to pursue our own independent economic political agenda without interference from other parties, namely US imperialism. And in that defense of sovereignty, she issues this letter and actually it plays out really well. She lines out a bunch of details in terms of what's actually being done to mitigate the flow of migrants and drugs and all of this into the United States from Mexico. But it seems like that led to Trump kind of backing down a little bit. And it was surprising to many observers because, famously, sexist Trump was about to be put in his place by a woman. And yet, I think, her strategy has proven to be the more successful, especially if you compare it to the Canadian reaction. So what has been the Canadian reaction? I think it's really telling that immediately afterwards, we saw Chrysler Freeland, who now has left cabinet, go on a press conference and say, we're reconstituting our emergency US-Canada committee, cabinet level. This is going to be on a par with COVID so they can respond quickly. I mean, I think it's very, very clear that they hit the panic button, that they were very scared of Trump. And I think if we had to attribute it to one thing, it's that in Mexico, there's a very strong, popular, recently inaugurated, recently reelected political force and power, which has the support of the population, which knows that if push comes to shove, that they will have the support of the population. And in Canada, you have a very weak government that is basically losing much of its leadership. Justin Trudeau may not even last very much longer as the leader of the Liberal Party and therefore the prime minister. So I think comparing those is really quite telling. When it comes to facing down Trump, it's more important to actually defend your country's sovereignty, to defend your political and national interests, to be dignified in your response. If you lay down before Trump, he's going to walk all over you, as he has, because since then, he's kind of backed off Mexico. We'll see what he actually does in office, because I think there's a lot of noise coming from Trump's HQ right now. I mean, recently he was talking about taking over the Panama Canal. That seems something that seems very unlikely in my opinion. But with Canada, you have basically they're dragging themselves before Trump, and now we see him calling him the governor of the 51st state. It's interesting because in response, Canada seems to want to throw Mexico under the bus. There's this very confused notion that if we screw over Mexico, then we'll be okay as Canadians, right? We'll feed Mexico to the Trump wolves, and then we'll be able to get out of that situation. That just hasn't played out that way. It's a huge mistake on their part.
And that was the other thing I wanted to ask you about is that is very clear that that's what Canadian politicians, Ontario Premier Doug Ford was pretty clear about that. Even a little bit before Trump's threat, he's sort of making these anti-Mexico kind of comments. And Scheinbaum said something to the effect of Mexico has a much greater, I don't know, cultural heritage than Canada or something to that effect, which I thought was, I appreciated one level. I also thought maybe there'd be some First Nations that would have some legitimate objections to that comment. But I think as a general sense is probably was certainly apt, correct. But yeah, so what's the sort of reaction in Mexico to how Canada has responded to Trump's threats and sort of and the throwing of Mexico under the bus?
Yeah. So Claudia didn't quite say that there's more in Mexico than Canada, but she's just basically talked about we're a very rich country and all of this. We don't need to kind of fall into that trap. And in fact, when asked about, because Claudia Sheinbaum kept up López Obrador's tradition of the weekly or the daily press conference. So every weekday she does a press conference and faces down critical questions, and was asked about, well, what do you think about some of these premiers talking about Mexico this way? What do you think about Trump saying that Canada is the 51st state? And she stuck up for Canadian sovereignty, saying, I don't think we should be talking about Canada that way. I disagree with that. I'm not going to be here answering Trump's every other tweet, but I will want to say that. In fact, so she was actually quite supportive of Canada in this position. And that's actually been Mexico's historic position. I want to remind everybody that in the last round of negotiations, so when Trump was elected in his first term, and they did the whole renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, they wanted to kick Canada out of that. Trump wanted to kick Canada out. And it was López Obrador who advocated and said, no, we should need to face this as, this needs to be a tri-country agreement. We won't kick out Canada. He managed to convince them. And now it's interesting in this round, Canada trying to sacrifice Mexico before this. In terms of the reaction here to that, I mean, Mexicans are a nationalist population to begin with. Being neighbors with the United States cultivates that kind of relationships. Having faced off empires in our history makes us very proud to defend our territory and our national sovereignty, right? And in particular, when it comes to the US relationship, there isn't that much conversation when it comes to Canada about Mexico, which I think is unfortunate. I think there probably should be more conversations, particularly amongst activists and organizers, so that we can better coordinate our respective actions when it comes to imperialism. It looks different in each country, but I do think there needs to be more cooperation there. But the reaction has mostly been a lot of nationalist fervor, of Mexicans saying that we are proud and we don't have anything to apologize for. And, Canada needs to get its house in order if they're going to be responding to this current conjuncture the way that they're doing. It's been unfortunate to see the Canadian politicians. And I was actually on a program on TVO a little while ago. And in fact, the host of that program said, oh, my insiders in the Liberal Party said they were happy when they heard Danielle Smith and Doug Ford talking ill about Mexico and wanting to get rid of Mexico in this relationship. And so even in the halls of power inside of the PMO, apparently there are voices who are in favor of this. I really want to insist that it's a really confused strategy. I think most of it is driven by this concern over China. I think what this is actually about is a geopolitical conflict. Mexico has had an incredible last 6 years. Things have really turned around in terms of the country's prospect, largely thanks to the change in government with Lopez Obrador and now Claudia Sheinbaum. And so, even in that case, right, Mexico is never really going to be a hegemonic rival to the United States. But the one that can be is China. And so I think a lot of the policymakers, people like Marco Rubio, who's going to be Secretary of State in the United States, are largely going to be concentrated on their issues with China. And so everything kind of revolves around that. How can we get Mexico to join in on this crusade? How can we get Canada to really join in? And they largely have. But, right before we started this program, you and I were talking about the fact that in a lot of ways, Mexico is immune to those kinds of foreign policy pressures that the United States applies in other cases, that it has clearly applied in the case of Canada and is clearly applying in the case of its allies like Australia and most of the Western European nations, right? Mexico in that way has not cooperated. And I think if the aim is to ultimately create this kind of bloc that resists China, right? Because the narrative is Mexico is China's backdoor to the North American Economic Union. Well, I don't think they're going to get very far. Mexico has an independent foreign policy, right? It has different relationships. It has a very positive relationship with China. Xi Jinping and Claudia Sheinbaum had a very friendly meeting at the G20, right? And so if that's the aim, I think they're going to fail.
Well, that's very interesting that you bring up the China issue, and to contrast the Canada's relationship to China versus Mexico's relationship. Because one of the things I remember, the Globe and Mail, when Meng Wanzhou, the former CFO of forgetting the name of the big Chinese company right now,
Huawei.
Huawei. When they arrested her at the Vancouver airport, she was actually en route, I believe, to Mexico City.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a stopover at the Vancouver airport. And I believe it was a Globe Mail piece. They said they actually they asked Mexican officials, and the Mexican officials said, "There's no way we were going to arrest her. There's no way we would have just done what the Americans wanted and arrested her." And that incident, of course, was an important factor in the kind of unraveling of relationship between the Trudeau government and China. So, so I think that it's very clear that Canada has fully joined the anti-China campaign, and that has, tied to the fact that Canada is part of the Five Eyes intelligence arrangement, the sort of white supremacist Australia, British, UK, US, New Zealand, whereas Mexico isn't. Canada's been part of all these British, US targeting of China going back, 100 plus years, even really. So that gets, I guess, maybe somewhat to the another side to the Canadian reaction to Trump's tariff threat that I think is an important, at least for a left audience, to think about and consider, which is I think that a big chunk of the left is really basically bought into the U.S. empire in Canada, whereas they're not in Mexico. And so when Trump is calling for a massive increase in military spending, if you believe in the NATO proxy war in Ukraine, then this push to substantially increase Canadian military spending maybe seems sort of reasonable. If you think that it actually is a NATO proxy war in Ukraine, which I think most Mexicans probably think, or at least those paying attention to international affairs think, then you don't necessarily see the need to increase military spending. So, what's your kind of, I guess, it's a kind of a general question, but in terms of that and the sort of contrast of you mentioned that Mexico has an independent foreign policy that I think is implicit that Canada doesn't have, which is I think definitely the case. But yeah, can you discuss maybe a bit of that side or a bit of the contrast between the Canadian and Mexican foreign policies?
Yeah, earlier I said that Mexico in some ways is immune to this pressure. And the reason I say it, I think if you looked at the reaction by most states to what I also consider a proxy war in Ukraine, many people fell in line, right? Leaders said, yes, all right, we have to save Europe. We have to stop the Russian bear at the door, et cetera, right? This ridiculous rhetoric that they use. And there was similar pressure on Mexico. Mexico is very much considered a close ally of the United States, right? And so they expect, in fact, they were used to Mexican presidents kind of going along with their foreign policy plans. You have to remember, Mexico was a major player in the Lima group, which sought to oust Nicolas Maduro from power in Venezuela. But under Lopez Obrador and now Claudia Sheinbaum, there has been much more strident defense of sort of the traditional Mexican foreign policy, something that's called the Estrada Doctrine, which is non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, to respect the sovereignty of the peoples of other nations. And so Mexico didn't respond to this pressure. They did not issue sanctions on Russia. They did not join this whole circus of trying to so-called, quote unquote, defend democracy in Ukraine. The pressure is obviously less here, but we did see it, and there's many journalists who are obsessed with this notion. There's this journalist, Mexican correspondent based in Washington, D.C. named Dolia Esteves, and she's always talking about how the Russian embassy is after her and things like that. And certainly amongst some corners that has some echo, but when it comes to the actual policy of the government, we haven't seen that. And then there's also obviously the situation, the genocide being perpetrated by the Zionist entity against the Palestinian people, in particular Gaza. Mexico has played actually a really positive role on that. They referred the case to the ICC together with Chile. They were very critical of the actions of the Israeli government in Palestine. They've called for an immediate ceasefire, right? There's none of this like, Hamas is to blame for everything. That's not really part of the rhetoric here. You will see some talk about, releasing the hostages in the same time that they call for an immediate ceasefire and suspension of military activity. But I think, under Lopez Obrador, we've also seen the recognition of the state of Palestine in a way that hadn't happened before, the opening of diplomatic relations, which has continued with Claudia Sheinbaum's government as well. And so, if we consider those litmus tests in terms of what is the perspective here, we've seen that Mexico does indeed have an independent foreign policy. And to go back to this whole trade issue, right? Mexico, like I said, has a very deeply integrated economy with the United States, less so with Canada, but there is a relationship there. A sudden change would be very disruptive, but that doesn't mean that Mexico hasn't also been pursuing other options, right? It rescued the community of Latin American and Caribbean states from irrelevance, bringing it back to becoming a more powerful regional voice, regional body where more discussions could take place. There's a very critical view of the Organization of American States here in Mexico, which is the Ministry of Colonies of the United States, as we call it here in Latin America. And so, throughout all of this, what we're seeing is that this idea that if this is not necessarily the language that the government used, but this is something that I would describe it, right? Mexico is in support of a multipolar world. It is in support of having different relationships without necessarily the exclusion of the other. So yes, Mexico is actually investing billions into expanding its Manzanillo port in order to facilitate trade with Asia, China, the rest of that market, but also preserving its relationship with North America. And, often I think a lot of people fall into this trap that the trade relationship implies that you're going to have to toe the line, right? That you're going to have to obey the dictates of US imperialism. I think in the case of Canada, unfortunately, that has been true. They've been convinced of this. There seems to be this sense that Canadian politicians want to signal, we're part of the club. So whatever you ask us to do, we'll do, like kidnapping Huawei's, executive, as an example. But it's not necessary. Mexico shows that it's not necessary. You can have a trade relationship with the United States without necessarily sacrificing your relationship with other important economic players like China, like Russia, like the BRICS, et cetera, et cetera. And so that brings us to this present reality, right? Where I think really what the U.S. is looking when it comes to Mexico is action on migration and action on the movement of illicit substances, which is something that has largely defined the relationship since the beginning of the so-called war against the cartels by Felipe Calderon in the early 2000s. And so as long as Mexico kind of keeps a lid on that, I think our relationship with the United States will be fine. What's really unfortunate is that as a result of all of this, the relationship with Canada is now starting to be strained.
And one other thing, so we talked about this a bit before coming on, and I did something on this a while ago trying to make this point that, the Americans are saying, and all of the political class really, and all the media commentators in Canada, we have to increase military spending
Mm-hmm.
if we want to keep trading with the U.S. And but as you mentioned, Mexico actually is more dependent on trade with the U.S. than Canada is. My statistics were 80% of Mexican trade was going, at least a couple of years ago, was going to the U.S., whereas about 75% of Canadian. And so this whole business, we have to hit 2% of GDP, military spending, which is a NATO target, but the politicians say and the media says we have to do it because of our relationship to the U.S. and Trump. And Mexico spends a whole lot less on its military. Even a couple years ago, when I looked at it, it was about half of Canada's proportion of GDP. So Canada's around 1.4%, Mexico is around 0.7%, and in actual dollar terms, it was also about half. Um, I think that, as you mentioned, Canada being part of the club, I think Mexico has not, sent troops to bomb Libya in 2011 or 40,000 troops to Afghanistan. And so Canada has this relationship to the U.S. Military and the U.S. War machine that is, I think, somewhat of a unique relationship that's very different than Mexico. So the U.S. is not putting that pressure on Mexico to increase military spending, but because it doesn't see increasing military spending as adding to the U.S. empire, like it does see that
Yeah.
when Canada increases military spending. But yeah, can you just talk a little bit about that, specific question? Because this is sort of like across the board, even into like kind of leftish areas, basically accepting this notion that we have to increase Canadian military spending, either because of NATO, because of Trump, because the U.S. wants it, etc.
Yeah, but before I begin my response, I do want to be clear. I think the Mexican armed forces and the U.S. armed forces are very close. They have a very close relationship, and that hasn't changed very much, even with the election of López Obrador. That being said, there has been a shift in terms of the priorities of the armed forces in Mexico. I think if you look at the armed forces historically in Mexico, basically up until the 90s, what you saw was very typical of armed forces in Latin America pressured by the US to engage in quote unquote national security operations, which should be understood as the persecution of the left, the persecution of guerrilla forces that happened here in Mexico as well, is known as the Dirty War. But certainly, in the more modern era, what we've seen is the armed forces very much be dedicated to internal security when it comes to the power of organized crime groups. And so that's what the armed forces basically since 2006 have been up to in Mexico. Although there's been a very important shift with López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum, which is that it's certainly less bellicose. There used to be like, we have to take out the cartels. This is a war, and we have to use the power of the state and the muscle of the state to do this. What we see now is a shift in the rhetoric in terms of what they say is we have to conquer peace, right? To actually secure peaceful situations for countries or parts of the country that are experiencing this kind of violent turmoil. But we also saw a shift in terms of the armed forces in their role. So it's very weird because, like, I want to insist on this. Their doctrine is still very much inspired by U.S. Military doctrine. But it's also an armed forces that has a very different history. It's born out of the revolution of Mexico in the early 20th century. And so it's also kind of tried to cultivate that connection with, the very bottom rung of Mexican society. Like so many other armed forces, that's where most of the troops come from. But there's this emphasis on trying to make them rise and become officer class in that. But anyway, the shift that I saw with López Obrador was one where instead of exclusively focused on conflict, The armed forces, because it was one of the few remaining institutions that wasn't totally hollowed out by neoliberalism, became one of the instruments for actual nation building. So they were charged with building airports, building the Tren Maya in the Yucatan. They were involved with a lot of these kinds of infrastructure projects, and they saw their budget grow quite extraordinarily during those years. But now that those projects are done, now that the kind of the capacity of the state in general has increased, and you don't always have to rely on the armed forces, we've actually seen a huge cut this year in the budget. Claudia Sheinbaum's first budget, we saw a 43.8% cut to the national armed forces here in Mexico. So instead of increasing, what we're actually seeing is a cut. And so again, in that instance, what we see is Mexico not necessarily feeling this pressure to spend more on this. But it's also important to recognize, right? I spoke about the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution produced a constitution. You know, it's been amended hundreds of times, but it's still a social constitution. It's a social document. And it even has elements like this. Like, for example, Mexican troops can't leave Mexican territory. There has to be a declaration of war issued by Congress. So this idea that Mexico is going to go and participate in, you know, the occupation of Haiti is a non-starter here, and I hope it stays that way. But I do think that one thing that needs to happen, and I hope that it happens soon, we still have these training exercises, for example, right? They get special permission for the U.S. troops to come to Mexico, and you know, I'm not interested in that, in deepening the relationship with the U.S. armed forces. They are the major force of evil in this world. And so I think what we need to see is something that we saw in Venezuela, which is a total break with the previous military doctrine, a new military doctrine, a peaceful military doctrine that isn't reliant on the United States, and that we start to really break up that relationship that exists between the upper echelon of the armed forces and those in Mexico and the United States.
So thanks a lot for this discussion. People can check out Jose's writing on Venezuela analysis, the Soberanía podcast. Thanks a lot for coming on talking foreign policy.
Thanks so much for having me. And I hope that we can use this opportunity to think about how we can better coordinate as left forces. I think one of the things we need to see more of is, you know, there was a very interesting project happening here in Mexico, something that I think a lot of people started paying attention to, especially particularly because Kamala Harris lost, right? But it's not just that, right? There really is a very exciting post-neoliberal elements of socialist transformation happening in Mexico. And I think more people in Canada, if they were aware of it, they would be inspired by it. They would understand that there's a lot of really good lessons in terms of how this process has happened. It's really become quite a powerful political force in this country. It's almost unstoppable. They have a supermajority in Congress. They've been just reelected, sky high approval ratings. I think if the left is serious about challenging power, Mexico has lessons for North America and the world.
And clearly, they have lessons to teach Canada in how to react to Donald Trump's tariff threats. Thanks a lot again, Jose.